far too many other countries, the loss of a limb, maybe the loss of income by the breadwinner, and a family that is condemned to poverty as a result of it. And we've heard, moreover, too, that when we talk about the numbers of people with diabetes, approximately 1 in 2 hasn't been diagnosed. And I needn't tell an audience like this, who day and daily deal with people with diabetes, that somebody with undiagnosed diabetes stands a serious risk of developing a life-threatening or serious complication which can affect their health and their quality of life enormously. There's been a tendency by global policymakers, like the World Health Organization, to regard diabetes as just one of these conditions that exists, but it's not as serious as the communicable disease of HIV, tuberculosis, and cancers, and TB. But the fact of the matter is that if you add up the deaths through HIV, through tuberculosis, and through malaria, they are much less than the cases of premature mortality through diabetes. And that, I think, is the reason that the World Health Organization is at last getting its head round the challenges of a major chronic disease like diabetes. And of course, when we look at this global burden, it doesn't fall fairly or evenly. 4 out of 5 of the new cases of diabetes will be in the developing world. And in the developing world, what they need above all to achieve economic development is healthy people of working age who can contribute to the growth and prosperity of the country. If these same people are dying early, dying prematurely of diabetes complications, or are incapacitated through the loss of sight or the loss of a limb, then it's not just affecting health in the country, it's affecting economic development. And the smart countries that understand the challenge of diabetes know that a healthy country is very likely to be a wealthy country. And we take the figures in MENA region, and Nizar told us earlier that the MENA region has the highest prevalence. And if we look at the figures of prevalence in the major countries within the MENA region, we can see that nearly 8 million people in Egypt are estimated to have diabetes. A prevalence rate which may be lower than the Gulf and lower than Saudi Arabia, but it still is a hugely challenging figure. IDF has a distinguished pedigree in championing diabetes and encouraging global health policymakers to accept it as the major challenge that it is. That global advocacy work started with the United Nations resolution, and Morsi will well remember the great work that he did in the MENA region, encouraging the national associations, encouraging people involved in healthcare to put pressure upon governments to sign up to the UN resolution. And that was a success. It was a success for diabetes and a success for the International Diabetes Federation. And it was largely as a result of that successful initiative in 2006 that the Non-Communicable Disease Alliance came together and advocated strongly for the historic global health targets. And I want to draw your attention to 2 of these targets, because here we see the target to halt the rise in obesity and diabetes, and down on the bottom right-hand corner, that 80% of the world's population would get access to essential medicines and technologies. These are hugely challenging targets. And if we really are to reverse the growth of obesity and diabetes, as this target says, we cannot leave this matter just to happen chance. We have to make sure that governments are not just ensuring that healthcare is available to people with diabetes, but more important, that they are actually preventing the growth that is leading to the pressure upon the healthcare systems everywhere in the developed world and the undeveloped world. And we know that if people cannot get access to healthcare, then not only is their diabetes not being diagnosed, but the greater danger is that the life-threatening complications are taking hold and may end that person's life before they can get access to healthcare. Now, IDF has done good work in producing its Global Diabetes Scorecard. That's an initiative of the Federation, and it's very welcome. But it's not the only contribution to monitoring progress. The World Health Organization understands that if it has targets, it's got to be in a position of monitoring the progress that individual countries are making about the targets. And it has produced a book, a very helpful book, which lists every country in the world and the progress that it's making on these targets. I have to say that Egypt is making some progress, but it could do better. But then every country in the world could do better. So I think the interim report from the World Health Organization, it indicates the areas in which progress is being made and highlights the areas in which progress is still to be made. So to all of you who are in a position to influence policymakers, I would say this: it's not enough that the government agrees to the target unless it's actually doing something about it. And I'll give you an example that both surprised and shocked me. I was in a country in South America, and I don't want to name it, but I was in the country in South America and went to meet the Minister of Health and all her senior officials. And after we'd had a general discussion about health matters, I leant over and said, "Minister, how are you getting on with the global health targets? And is there anything that IDF can do, because IDF has a wealth of experienced people who can offer advice on these matters?" And she looked at me in a very puzzled way and said, "The global health targets?" And she turned to the chief of the health department on her right and asked him, and he shook his head. And he turned to his deputy, who looked equally surprised. And they turned to the communications chief, and he shrugged his shoulders. And finally, the last man on the line was the policy man. And he said, "Oh yes, Minister, we have signed the global health targets." Now, if the minister didn't know, and the permanent secretaries in the health department didn't know, who was doing anything about trying to achieve the targets? And the interesting thing was that when these targets were all agreed, there was much pleasure and much self-congratulation at the World Health Assembly in Geneva, and I happened to be sitting beside the ambassador for that country. And he said to me, "Sir Michael, my country will lead South America on progress on the global health targets." You can understand why I'm quite cynical. If you live as long as I've done and you spend 15 years of your life in frontline politics, you very quickly become cynical. But that simply illustrates the gulf between good intentions and purposeful action. And the whole of civil society has to unite together if we're to make a real difference in an area like this. The doctors you do fantastic work every single day with the people that you look after. So people with diabetes who are privileged to receive health care from you are kept in good health, and that is excellent. But doctors alone cannot do it. Neither can the people with diabetes, whether they're in a diabetes association or not. This is an area where we all in civil society have to work together. Doctors, healthcare professionals, people with diabetes, and their representatives, to make sure that the people who do influence policy understand the importance of taking action. and largely also as a result of the campaigning work done by IDF and the Non-Communicable Disease Alliance, we now have a Sustainable Development Goal. These are the successors to the Millennium Development Goals, which were approved last year at the United Nations General Assembly. And for the first time, there is a specific target on health. And you'll see what it is. The overarching target is to reduce avoidable mortality by 1/3 and to make sure that everyone on Earth has access to health. For the first time, the United Nations has declared that access to health care is a right for people rather than a privilege. And I've said this before, but as somebody whose daughter has been privileged to receive the best health care that it's possible to provide, you will understand why I have a passion and an aspiration to make sure that every other citizen on this earth has that same right, though it will take a long time to achieve it. So I want just to say something in the last few minutes about why it's important to engage with government, and why, if we are ever to reduce the figures for obesity and diabetes, and not just accept that every year they will go on rising, we've got to make sure that government understands its role in education, to make sure that young people are introduced to the importance of a healthy diet, that they have access to the right kind of food, and if they're being fed the wrong, unhealthy kind of food, that they have the knowledge to say to their parents, as an earlier generation said to parents about tobacco use, "Mum and Dad, you need to change the food that we're eating, because otherwise we're going to become obese, we're going to be overweight, and we're going to become susceptible to the diseases that Ines spoke to us about this morning." And governments influence the education curriculum. In no country does education not have government input and influence. So that's the first task for government. The second one is to promote physical exercise. I'm amazed that I go to buildings where it's not possible to climb the stairs because it's only escalators and it's only lifts. And yet simple exercise of walking every day on a consistent basis can help to reduce the lack of physical exercise that can be so damaging to health. But I admit honestly that when you have a climate that is very warm, even hot, it's much more difficult to exercise than one can in a cooler country like mine. Governments also are responsible for public health messaging. Diabetes is a public health message, and governments have to be imaginative in the way that they present public health messaging. You can't lecture to people and wag your finger at them and say, you must do this and you must do that. Governments have got to be able to convince people that there are benefits in taking exercise, benefits in the amount of diet, in the type of diet that they follow, and the amount of food that they eat. And it's possible to do it without appearing to be dictatorial. And in town planning, well, if we're going to encourage people to take physical exercise, and we're going to encourage people to get on their bicycles and take exercise that way, we've got to design our towns and cities in a way that's conducive to that exercise. These are long-term things that are not going to be changed in 5, 10 years, perhaps not even in a generation, but they're things that we've got to make a start on. And agriculture, well, healthier foodstuffs. We've got to try and produce healthier foodstuffs. I know that it's a very sensitive matter, and diets in many countries are a cultural matter, but I am staggered at the amount of food that is presented to people. And of course, if the opportunity to eat is there, people by and large do so. And I'm not the best advertisement, I have to say, for healthy living, but I do understand the relationship between overweight and greater susceptibility to disease. And again, in relation to agriculture, governments have the means by which they can influence the development of healthier foodstuffs, and indeed in the ways that they can influence the choices that people make when they buy food. In my country, we're introducing a tax on sugar drinks and a tax on sugary products. The very threat of that tax is making the manufacturers of sugared carbonated drinks, making them change their product mixes, making them say, here is our non-sugar alternative. That's a good thing. I don't mind how it's done. I actually prefer the voluntary way that it's done. And Britain's had made great progress on reduction of salt content on food, not by taxation, not by regulation, and not by legislation, but by saying to the food companies, if you don't make your food more healthy, we'll make it healthy for you. So careful use of taxation and the other influences that governments have in Egypt, in every other country in the world, careful use of these things can help to make sure that we start to make real progress on meeting the global health targets. But you know, it's also an attitude of mind that policy has to be put at the heart of all new policies, that health has got to be there as an objective in new legislation. And if that is done, then I think there is a fair chance that we may see progress towards the global health targets. I may not have that many more years on this planet, but I hope that before I die, I hope that we can see the growth in obesity and diabetes. I hope we can see it reducing. Diabetes is a terrible disease, and unfortunately, type 2 diabetes is something which actually can be stopped or modified if people know about it. So there is the collective challenge for all of us, ladies and gentlemen. And as I say, the sooner we start to take the action, the sooner the World Health Organization will be producing an updated booklet which shows progress not just in Egypt, but in all other countries as well. Can I end just by reiterating my word of thanks for all that you do as clinicians and healthcare professionals. You help to keep people healthy. You help to improve their quality of life. The work that you do is noble, and it's hugely appreciated. Shukran.
So it's working now. Thank you. I have the honor to introduce our next speaker, Nam Shu, who is president-elect of our organization, IDF. Nam Shu is a well-known figure of diabetes worldwide. Has been graduate for Pittsburgh University in 1989, and then that he became professor at the University of Aju in South Korea. Between that, he had been working hard on diabetes. He had a lot of achievements. You can go to page 10 to see all, but I would say he's very active, and he's doing a very good job in our IDF board. Also, he's the current chairman of the scientific meeting preparation for IDF meeting in Abu Dhabi in 2017. Please welcome to our speaker, Nam Hu.
Thank you, Dr. Nariza, for your wonderful introduction, and I'd like to thank Dr. Ines again for giving me the opportunity to share some of the issues related to diabetes epidemiology. The reason I made a broad term of diabetes epidemiology as my title of my talk is because diabetes is broad term. Also, the epidemiologist way is sort of the roadmap to prevent and managing diabetes. So I'll start out with a brief introduction of a 7th Diabetes Atlas, and then findings from 16 years of a follow-up study from Korea, and which is all published in Scientific Index. And I will conclude how this diabetes epidemiology lead us in the future battling against the diabetes. As all of you know, that diabetes global epidemic out of control. This world map shows, I'm not going into the number 415 million, but this one shows almost 40 million, and WHO reported 422. That figure is when you increased age behind 80, we are adding another 25 million cases of diabetes, which indicated elderly population with diabetes, another issue that need to be tackled in the future. This slide depicts the the figure of diabetes, and blue color is 2015 figure, 2040 figure is lighter blue color, which shows the MENA region is ranking second, following North America and Caribbean region with a prevalence of about 11%. That rate is much higher than world rate, as well as Western Pacific, another part of the Asia, and Southeast Asia. Here's the picture of the MENA region, and then Saudi Arabia ranks first in prevalence, and Egypt follows right behind them. So MENA region, the prevalence of diabetes from 8 to as high as 20%. I wanted to bring your focus on this bar graph. That indicate age 40s in MENA region. If you compare the other region, for example, Western Pacific, their rate is 9, but MENA region, it increased to the 13. We don't know why they are high risk for the diabetes, but they are 1.44 times greater risk for diabetes, even comparing other Asian groups. If you look at the specifically in Egypt figure, 1 in 7 adults have a diabetes in your country. And 2015, you've been here enough, there are almost 8 million people living with diabetes in Egypt. And that figure could be as high as 9 million based on the confidence interval we give there. So this almost 8 million figures the prevalence of about 15%, that expect to be increased about 18% by 2040. What about the management level in terms of dollars? Now, per year, spending $219 to manage diabetes, and it'll drop $1 in 1940s. When you compare this figure with the other countries such as the United States, they are spending almost $4,000 per year to manage diabetes. So which clearly indicate where those people with diabetes living in Egypt stands in terms of diabetes management. What about number of the people with undiagnosed cases? Again, more than 3 million people, and more than 40% are still undiagnosed in this region, and 78,000 people died of diabetes each year. And then even the early mortality, that's age before 60, showing about 44% in your country. Here is the top 10 countries or territories for number of people with diabetes. As you can see on the left side of your figure, Egypt is ranking 8th. But by 2040, you will gain the rank by 7th. So I'm pretty sure you'd like to have gained another ranking like that in other aspects rather than number of diabetes in your country. So we have an assignment to do, stop this figure to hopefully go down behind the rank 10th. So I'd like to share diabetes trend. Where is diabetes trends, how is diabetes changing in the whole world? So I'd like to use some of the findings from our study in Korea. In 2001, Korean government, national government, gave me a grant to follow more than 10,000 subjects who lives in community. And every 2 years, we do the comprehensive examination to understand what is the risk factor of diabetes in Korean population. And baseline studies, this is what we found. If you look at the top line at age 40s, and the non-diabetes figure showing about 2.6% have a diabetes in Korea. And that is true. And that's what government always claims. We only have a 2.6% diabetes in age 40s. However, there is more number, 4.7% are hiding. They are asymptomatic. They have diabetes, but they don't know they have a diabetes. If you add these two figures, it's almost 8%, 7.3% in age group 40s have a diabetes. Another striking news is 18.5% are in pre-diabetes stage. If you combine all these two, almost 1 out of 4 in age 40s, young age group, have a diabetes or high risk for diabetes. If you look at the bottom line, combining all these 40, 56 age groups, about 30%, more than 30% has a diabetes or a high risk for diabetes in Korean population. This is what we observed. In age 50s, we compared it 10 years ago where we stand with the percentage of diabetes. In male, left side showing, it was 15.7%. But it rise to 26.1% after 10 years, increasing about almost 70% in 10 years. In females, it was 12.4% and rise to 17.3%. What about an age group in 60s? 10 years ago, it was 18.5% in males, but it increased to the 33%. In females also, it was 19%, but it rise to the 28% in 10 years period of time. So diabetes continues to increase in Korea as well as Asia. What is the reason for this? And we started to analyze economic aspect of diabetes in Korea. This is what we found. We start out from early 70s to this current years. The red line showing the GNI, economic growth in Korea, and diabetes prevalence. They are co-telling each other, look exactly like it. As the economic growth of the country, diabetes cases increases. You're probably wondering, what is this steep increase right here? What is the reason for that? That's when Korean government implemented a universal health insurance system, which lead to the start of finding hidden cases. So here's a sharp increase of diabetes cases. So growth economics or living better doesn't mean you're safe from diabetes. Actually, you're at risk for diabetes. So what about the risk factors? What we found risk factors in our country. This is all the risk factors we found so far. Metabolic syndrome is one of the risk factors. Living in an urban area, the IFG, IGT, combining IF-IGT is the 2.3 times greater risk for diabetes. Also, hypertension is risk, smoking is risk for diabetes, family history, physical stress sign is also risk, hemoglobin A1C, insulin, even the ALT values are also related to the diabetes. I cannot go into all details of these findings, probably need several hours, so I'm going to show you a couple of slides related to these risk factors. This is related to the metabolic syndrome. As you can see, those individuals who don't have metabolic syndrome at the beginning of the study, but 10 years later, about 13% develop diabetes, which means about 1% each year. Whereas those individuals have a more positive in metabolic syndrome, for example, 4 and plus, almost 50% of them converted to diabetes or developed diabetes during the 10-year period of follow-up. This is